Section 22, Part 5 of The Truth About the Titanic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Truth About the Titanic by Archibald Gracie. Starboard Side, Women First, but Men When There Were No Women. Part 5. Boat number 9. The fifth boat lowered on starboard side. 1:20, British report. No disorder when this boat was loaded and lowered. Passengers, Mesdames Aubert and maid, Mademoiselle Segesser. Futrelle, lines, Miss Lines, and second and third class. Men, 2 or 3. Said goodbye to wife and sank with ship, Mr. Futrelle. Crew, seamen, Haynes in charge, Wynne, QM, McGough, Peters, stewards, Ward, Widgery, and others. Total 56. Incidents: A. Haynes, boatswain's mate, American inquiry. Officer Murdoch and witness filled boat 9 with ladies. None of the men passengers tried to get into the boats. Officer Murdoch told them to stand back. There was one woman who refused to get in because she was afraid. When there were no more women forthcoming, the boat was full. When 2 or 3 men jumped into the bow. There were 2 sailors, 3 or 4 stewards, 3 or 4 firemen, and 2 or 3 men passengers. Number 9 was lowered from the boat deck, with 63 people in the boat and lowered all right. Officer Murdoch put the witness in charge and ordered him to row off and keep clear of the ship. When we saw it going down by the head, he pulled further away for the safety of the people in the boat. About 100 yards away at first. Cries were heard after the ship went down. He consulted with the sailors about going back and concluded with so many in the boat it was unsafe to do so. There was no compass in the boat, but he had a little pocket lamp. On Monday morning, he saw from 30 to 50 icebergs and a big field of ice miles long and large bergs and growlers, the largest from 80 to 100 feet high. W. Wynne, QM, British Inquiry. Officer Murdoch ordered witness into boat number 9. He assisted the ladies and took an oar. He says there were 56 all told in the boat, 42 of whom were women. He saw the light of a steamer, a red light first and then a white one, about 7 or 8 miles away. After an interval, both lights disappeared. 10 or 15 minutes afterward, he saw a white light again in the same direction. There was no lamp or compass in the boat. W. Ward, steward, American Inquiry. Witness assisted in taking the canvas cover off boat number 9 and lowered it to the level of the boat deck. Bryce, A.B., American Inquiry, and Wheat, assistant second steward, British Inquiry, say number 9 was filled from A deck with women and children only. Officer Murdoch, Purser McEnroy, and Mr. Ismay were near this boat when being loaded. A sailor came along with the bag and threw it into the boat. He said he had been sent to take charge of it by the captain. The boatswain's mate, Haynes, was there and ordered him out. He got out. Either Purser McElroy or Officer Murdoch said, "Pass the women and children that are here into that boat." There were several men standing around, and they fell back. There were quite a quantity of women, but he could not say how many were helped into the boat. There were no children. One old lady made a great fuss and absolutely refused to enter the boat. She went back to the companionway and forced her way in and would not get into the boat. One woman, a French lady, fell and hurt herself a little. Purser McElroy ordered 2 more men into the boat to assist the women. When number 9 was being lowered, the first listing of the ship was noticeable. From the rail to the boat was quite a distance to step down to the bottom of it, and in the dark the women could not see where they were stepping. Purser McElroy told witness to get into the boat to assist the women. Women were called for, but none came along and none were seen on deck at the time. 3 or 4 men were then taken into the boat until the officers thought they were sufficient to lower away with safety. Number 9 was lowered into the water before number 11. There was some difficulty in unlashing the oars because for some time no one had a knife. There were 4 men who rowed all night, but there were some of them in the boat who had never been to sea before and did not know the first thing about an oar or the bow from the stern. Haynes gave orders to pull away. When 200 yards off, rowing was stopped for about an hour. Haynes was afraid of suction, and we pulled away to about 1/4 mile from the ship. The ship went down very gradually for a while, by the head. We could just see the ports as she dipped. She gave a kind of sudden lurch forward. He heard a couple of reports like a volley of musketry, not like an explosion at all. His boat was too full, and it would have been madness to have gone back. He thinks number 9 was the 4th or 5th boat, picked up by the Carpathia. There was quite a big lot of field ice and several large icebergs in amongst the field, also 2 or 3 separated from the main body of the field. J. Widgery, bath steward, American Inquiry. Witness says that all passengers were out of their cabins on deck before he went up. When he got to the boat deck, number 7 was about to be lowered, but the purser sent him to number 9. The canvas had been taken off, and he helped lower the boat. Purser McElroy ordered him into the boat to help the boatswain's mate pass in women. Women were called for. An elderly woman came along. She was frightened. The boatswain's mate and himself assisted her, but she pulled away and went back to the door of the companionway and downstairs. Just before they left the ship, the officer gave the order to Haynes to keep about 100 yards off. The boat was full as it started to lower away. When they got to the water, he was the only one that had a knife to cut loose the oars. He says that the balance of his testimony would be the same as that of Mr. Ward, the previous witness. Boat number 11. 6th boat lowered on starboard side, 1:25. British report. No disorder when this boat was loaded and lowered. Passengers, women, Mrs. Shabert and 2 others of first cabin, all the rest second and third class. 58 women and children in all. Men, Mr. Mock, first cabin, and 2 others. Crew, seamen, Humphreys in charge, Bryce, stewards, Wheat, McKay, McKicken, Thiesinger, Wheelton, fireman, stewardess, Mrs. Robinson. Total, 70. Incidents, W. Bryce, A.B., American Inquiry. This boat was filled from A deck. An officer said, "Is there a sailor in the boat?" There was no answer. I jumped out and went down the fall into the bow. Nobody was in the stern. I went aft and shipped the rudder. By that time, the boat had been filled with women and children. We had a bit of difficulty in keeping the boat clear of a big body of water coming from the ship's side. The afterblock got jammed, but I think that must have been on account of the trip not being pushed right down to disconnect the block from the boat. We managed to keep the boat clear from this body of water. It was the pump discharge. There were only 2 seamen in the boat, a fireman, about 6 stewards, and 51 passengers. There were no women and children who tried to get into the boat and were unable to do so. There was no rush and no panic whatever. Everything was done in perfect order and discipline. Mr. Humphreys, A.B., was in charge of number 11. There was no light or lantern in our boat. I cut the lashing from the oil bottle and cut rope and made torches. The ship sank bow down first, almost perpendicularly. She became a black mass before she made the final plunge when boat was about 1/4 mile away. Boat number 9 was packed. Passengers were about 45 women and about 4 or 5 children in arms. E. Wilton, steward, American Inquiry. As I made along B deck, I met Mr. Andrews, the builder, who was opening the rooms and looking in to see if there was anyone in, and closing the doors again. Numbers 7, 5, and 9 had gone. Number 11 boat was hanging in the davits. Mr. Murdoch said, "You go too." He shouted, "Women and children first." He was then on the top deck standing by the taffrail. The boat was loaded with women and children, and I think there were 8 or 9 men in the boat altogether, including our crew and 1 passenger. "Have you got any sailors in?" asked Mr. Murdoch. I said, "No, sir." He told 2 sailors to jump into the boat. We lowered away. Everything went very smooth until we touched the water. When we pushed away from the ship's side, we had a slight difficulty in hoisting the after block. We pulled away about 300 yards. We rowed around to get close to the other boats. There were about 58 all told in number 11. It took all of its passengers from A deck, except the 2 sailors. I think there were 2 boats left on the starboard side when number 11 was lowered. The 8 or 9 men in the boat included a passenger. A quartermaster, Humphreys, was in charge. C.D. Mackay, steward, British Inquiry. Number 11 was lowered to A deck. Murdoch ordered me to take charge. We collected all the women, 40, on the boat deck, and on A deck we collected a few more. The crew were 5 stewards, 1 fireman, 2 sailors, 1 forward and 1 aft. There was Wheelton, McMicken, Thesinger, Wheat, and myself. The others were strangers to the ship. There were 2 second-class ladies, 1 second-class gentleman, and the rest were third-class ladies. I found out they were all third-class passengers. We had some difficulty in getting the afterfall away. We went away from the ship about a quarter of a mile. No compass. The women complained that they were crushed up so much and had to stand. Complaints were made against the men because they smoked. J.T. Wheat, Assistant Second Steward, British Inquiry. Witness went upstairs to the boat deck where Mr. Murdoch ordered the boats to the A deck, where the witness and 70 of his men helped pass the women and children into boat number 9, and none but women and children were taken in. He then filled up number 11 with 59 women and children, 3 male passengers, and a crew of 7 stewards, 2 sailors, and 1 fireman. He could not say how the 3 male passengers got there. The order was very good. There was nobody on the boat deck, so the people were taken off on the A deck. Philip E. Mock, first cabin passenger, letter. Number 11 carried the largest number of passengers of any boat, about 65. There were only 2 first cabin passengers in the boat besides my sister, Mrs. Shavert, and myself. The remainder were second class or stewards and stewardesses. We were probably a mile away when the Titanic's lights went out. I last saw the ship with her stern high in the air going down. After the noise, I saw a huge column of black smoke, slightly lighter than the sky, rising high into the sky, and then flattening out at the top like a mushroom. I at no time saw any panic and not much confusion. I can positively assert this, as I was near every boat lowered on the starboard side up to the time number 11 was lowered. With the exception of some stokers who pushed their way into boat number 3 or number 5, I saw no man or woman force entry into a lifeboat. One of these was number 13 going down before we touched the water. From address of the Attorney General, Sir Rufus Isaac, K.C., M.P. Number 11 took 70 and carried the largest number of any boat. Boat number 13. 7th boat lowered on starboard side, 125, British report. No disorder when this boat was loaded and lowered. Passengers, women. Second cabin, including Mrs. Caldwell and her child Alden. All the rest second and third class women. Men, Dr. Dodge, only first cabin passenger. Second cabin, Messrs. Beasley and Caldwell, 1 Japanese. Crew, firemen, Barrett in charge, Beauchamp, Major and 2 others. Stewards, Ray, Wright, and another, also Baker. Total 64. Incidents. Mr. Lawrence Beasley's book, already cited, gives an excellent description of number 13's history, but for further details, see his book, The Loss of the SS Titanic, Houghton, Mifflin Company, Boston. F. Barrett, leading stoker, British Inquiry. Witness then made his escape up the escape ladder and walked aft onto deck A on the starboard side, where only 2 boats were left, numbers 13 and 15. Number 13 was partly lowered when he got there. 5/6 in the boat were women. Number 15 was lowered about 30 seconds later. When number 13 got down to the water, he shouted, "Let go the afterfall." But, as no one took any notice, he had to walk over women and cut the fall himself. Number 15 came down nearly on top of them, but they just got clear. He took charge of the boat until he got so cold that he had to give up to someone else. A woman put a cloak over him, as he felt so freezing, and he could not remember anything after that. No men waiting on the deck got into his boat. They all stood in one line in perfect order, waiting to be told to get into the boat. There was no disorder whatever. They picked up nobody from the sea. F.D. Ray, steward, American Inquiry. Witness assisted in the loading of boat number 9 and saw it and number 11 boat lowered and went to number 13 on A deck. He saw it about half filled with women and children. A few men were ordered to get in. About 9 to a dozen passengers and crew. Dr. Washington Dodge was there and was told that his wife and child had gone away in one of the boats. Witness said to him, "You had better get in here then," and got behind him and pushed him and followed after him. A rather large woman came along, crying and saying, "Do not put me in the boat. I don't want to get in one. I have never been in an open boat in my life." He said, "You have got to go and you may as well keep quiet." After that, there was a small child rolled in a blanket thrown into the boat to him. The woman that brought it got into the boat afterwards. We left about 3 or 4 men on the deck at the rail, and they went along to number 15 boat. Number 13 was lowered away. When nearly to the water, 2 or 3 of them noticed a very large discharge of water coming from the ship's side, which he thought was the pumps working. The hole was about 2 feet wide and about a foot deep, with a solid mass of water coming out. They shouted for the boat to be stopped from being lowered, and they responded promptly and stopped lowering the boat. They pushed it off from the side of the ship until they were free from this discharge. He thinks there were no sailors or quartermasters in the boat because they apparently did not know how to get free from the tackle. Knives were called for to cut loose. In the meantime, they were drifting a little aft and boat number 15 was being lowered immediately upon them, about 2 feet from their heads, and they all shouted again, and they again replied very promptly and stopped lowering boat number 15. They elected a fireman, Barrett, to take charge. Stewart Wright was in the boat, 2 or 3 children and a very young baby, 7 months old. Besides number 9, 11, and 13, number 15 was lowered to deck A and filled from it. He saw no male passengers or men of the crew, whatever ordered out or thrown out of these lifeboats on the starboard side. Everybody was very orderly, and there was no occasion to throw anybody out. In number 13, there were about 4 or 5 firemen, 1 baker, 3 stewards, about 9 of the crew. Dr. Washington Dodge was the only first-class passenger, and the rest were third-class. There was 1 Japanese. There was no crowd whatever on A deck. While he was loading these boats, number 13 was full. Extracts from Dr. Washington Dodge's address, The Loss of the Titanic, a copy of which he kindly sent me. I heard one man say that the impact was due to ice. Upon one of his listeners questioning the authority of this, he replied, "Go up forward and look down on the forecastle deck, and you can see for yourself." I at once walked forward to the end of the promenade deck, and looking down could see, just within the starboard rail, small fragments of broken ice, amounting possibly to several cartloads. As I stood there, an incident occurred which made me take a more serious view of the situation than I otherwise would. Two stokers, who had slipped up onto the promenade deck unobserved, said to me, "Do you think there is any danger, sir?" I replied, "If there is any danger, it would be due to the vessel's having sprung a leak, and you ought to know more about it than I." They replied in what appeared to me to be an alarmed tone, "Well, sir, the water was pouring into the stokehold when we came up, sir." At this time, I observed quite a number of steerage passengers who were amusing themselves by walking over the ice and kicking it about the deck. No ice or iceberg was to be seen in the ocean. I watched the boats on the starboard side as they were successively filled and lowered away. At no time during this period was there any panic, or evidence of fear, or unusual alarm. I saw no women nor children weep, nor were there any evidence of hysteria observed by me. I watched all boats on the starboard side, comprising the odd numbers from 1 to 13, as they were launched. Not a boat was launched which would not have held from 10 to 25 more persons. Never were there enough women or children present to fill any boat before it was launched. In all cases, as soon as those who responded to the officer's call were in the boats, the order was given to lower away. What the conditions were on the port side of the vessel I had no means of observing. We were in semi-darkness on the boat deck, and owing to the immense length and breadth of the vessel, and the fact that between the port and the starboard side of the boat deck there were officers' cabins, staterooms for passengers, a gymnasium, and innumerable immense ventilators, it would have been impossible, even in daylight, to obtain a view of but a limited portion of this boat deck. We only knew what was going on within a radius of possibly 40 feet. Boats number 13 and 15 were swung from the davits at about the same moment. I heard the officer in charge of number 13 say, "We'll lower this boat to deck A." Observing a group of possibly 50 or 60 about boat 15, a small proportion of which number were women. I descended by means of a stairway close at hand to the deck below, deck A. Here, as the boat was lowered even with the deck, the women, about 8 in number, were assisted by several of us over the rail of the steamer into the boat. The officer in charge then hauled the boat and called repeatedly for more women, none appearing, and there being none visible on the deck, which was then brightly illuminated. The men were told to tumble in. Along with those present, I entered the boat. Ray was my table steward and called to me to get in. The boat in which I embarked was rapidly lowered, and as it approached the water, I observed, as I looked over the edge of the boat, that the bow, near which I was seated, was being lowered directly into an enormous stream of water, 3 or 4 feet in diameter, which was being thrown with great force from the side of the vessel. This was the water thrown out by the condenser pumps. Had our boat been lowered into the same, it would have been swamped in an instant. The loud cries which were raised by the occupants of the boat caused those who were 60 or 70 feet above us to cease lowering our boat. Securing an oar with considerable difficulty, as the oars had been firmly lashed together by means of heavy tarred twine, and as in addition they were on the seat running parallel with the side of the lifeboat, with no less than 8 or 10 occupants of the boat sitting on them, none of whom showed any tendency to disturb themselves. We pushed the bow of the lifeboat, by means of the oar, a sufficient distance away from the side of the Titanic, to clear this great stream of water which was gushing forth. We were then safely lowered to the water. During the few moments occupied by these occurrences, I felt for the only time a sense of impending danger. We were directed to pull our lifeboat from the steamer and to follow a light which was carried in one of the other lifeboats, which had been launched prior to ours. Our lifeboat was found to contain no lantern, as the regulations require, nor was there a single sailor or officer in the boat. Those who undertook to handle the oars were poor oarsmen, almost without exception, and our progress was extremely slow. Together with 2 or 3 other lifeboats which were in the vicinity, we endeavored to overtake the lifeboat which carried the light, in order that we might not drift away and possibly become lost. This light appeared to be 1/4 of a mile distant, but, in spite of our best endeavors, we were never enabled to approach any nearer to it, although we must have rowed at least a mile. End of section 22, part 5. Section 23 of The Truth About the Titanic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Truth About the Titanic by Archibald Gracie. Starboard Side, Women First, but Men When There Were No Women, Part 6. Boat number 15, British report, places this next to last lowered on starboard side at 1:35. No disorder in loading or lowering this boat. Passengers, all third-class women and children, 53, and men, Mr. Haven, first class, and 3 others, third class only. Total 4. Crew, fireman, Diamond in charge, Cavell, Taylor. Stewards, Rule, Hart, total 13. Grand total, British report, 70. Incidents, G. Cavell, trimmer, British inquiry. The officer ordered 5 of us in the boat. We took on all the women and children, and the boat was then lowered. We lowered to the first class, i.e. A deck, and took on a few more women and children, about 5, and then lowered to the water. From the lower deck we took in about 60. There were men about, but we did not take them in. They were not kept back. They were third-class passengers, I think. 60 women, Irish. Fireman Diamond took charge. No other seamen in this boat. There were none left on the third-class decks after I had taken the women. S.J. Rule, bathroom steward, British inquiry. Mr. Murdoch called to the men to get into the boat. About 6 got in. That will do, he said. Lower away to deck A. At this time, the vessel had a slight list to port. We sent scouts around both to the starboard and port sides. They came back and said there were no more women and children. We filled up on A deck, 68 all told, the last boat to leave the starboard side. There were some left behind. There was a bit of a rush after Mr. Murdoch said we could fill the boat up with men standing by. We very nearly came on top of number 13 when we lowered away. A man, Jack Stewart, a steward, took charge. Nearly everybody rowed. No lamp, 1 deckhand in the boat, and men, women, and children. Just before it was launched, no more could be found, and about 6 men got in. There were 68 in the boat altogether, 7 members of the crew. J. E. Hart, third-class steward, British inquiry. Witness defines the duties and what was done by the stewards, particularly those connected with the steerage. Pass the women and children up to the boat deck was the order soon after the collision. About 3/4 of an hour after the collision, he took women and children from the sea deck to the first-class main companion. There were no barriers at that time. They were all opened. He took about 30 to boat number 8 as it was being lowered. He left them and went back for more, meeting third-class passengers on the way to the boats. He brought back about 25 more steerage, women, and children, having some little trouble owing to the men passengers wanting to get to the boat deck. These were all third-class people whom we took to the only boat left on the starboard side, viz. number 15. There were a large number already in the boat, which was then lowered to A deck, and 5 women, 3 children, and a man with a baby in his arms taken in, making about 70 people in all, including 13 or 14 of the crew and Fireman Diamond in charge. Mr. Murdoch ordered witness into the boat. 4 men passengers and 14 crew was the complement of men. The rest were women and children. When boat number 15 left the boat deck, there were other women and children there, some first-class women passengers and their husbands. Absolute quietness existed. There were repeated cries for women and children. If there had been any more women, there would have been found places for them in the boat. He heard some of the women on the A deck say they would not leave their husbands. There is no truth in the statement that any of the seamen tried to keep back third-class passengers from the boat deck. Witness saw a masthead light of a ship from the boat deck. He did his very best, and so did all the other stewards, to help get the steerage passengers on the boat deck as soon as possible. Englehart Boat C. British report makes this last boat lowered on starboard side at 1:40. No disorder in loading or lowering this boat. Passengers, President Ismay, Mr. Carter, balance women and children. Crew, Quartermaster Rowe in charge. Steward Pierce, Barbara Weichman, Fireman 3. Stowaways, 4 Chinamen or Filipinos. Total 39. Incidents: G.T. Rowe, QM, American Inquiry, and British Inquiry. To avoid repetition, the testimony of this witness before the 2 courts of inquiry is consolidated. He assisted the officer, Boxall, to fire distress signals until about 5 and 20 minutes past 1. At this time, they were getting out the starboard collapsible boats. Chief Officer Wild wanted a sailor. Captain Smith told him to get into the boat C, which was then partly filled. He found 3 women and children in there with no more about. 2 gentlemen got in, Mr. Ismay and Mr. Carter. Nobody told them to get in. No one else was there. In the boat there were 39 altogether. These 2 gentlemen, 5 of the crew including himself, 3 firemen, a steward, and near daybreak they found 4 Chinamen or Filipinos who had come up between the seats. All the rest were women and children. Before leaving the ship, he saw a bright light about 5 miles away, about 2 points on the port bow. He noticed it after he got into the boat. When he left the ship, there was a list to port of 6 degrees. The order was given to lower the boat, with witness in charge. The rub strake kept on catching on the rivets down the ship's side, and it was as much as we could do to keep off. It took a good 5 minutes on account of this rubbing to get down. When they reached the water, they steered for a light in sight, roughly 5 miles. They seemed to get no nearer to it and altered their course to a boat that was carrying a green light. When day broke, the Carpathia was in sight. In regard to Mr. Ismay's getting into the boat, the witness's testimony before the American Court of Inquiry is cited in full. Senator Burton, now tell us the circumstances under which Mr. Ismay and that other gentleman got into the boat. Mr. Rowe, when Chief Officer Wild asked if there were any more women and children, there was no reply, so Mr. Ismay came into the boat. Senator Burton, Mr. Wild asked if there were any more women and children. Can you say that there were none? Mr. Rowe: I could not see, but there were none forthcoming. Senator Burton: You could see around there on the deck, could you not? Mr. Rowe: I could see the firemen and steward that completed the boat's crew, but as regards any families, I could not see any. Senator Burton: Were there any men passengers beside Mr. Ismay and the other man? Mr. Rowe: I did not see any, sir. Senator Burton: Was it light enough so that you could see anyone nearby? Mr. Rowe: Yes, sir. Senator Burton: Did you hear anyone ask Mr. Ismay and Mr. Carter to get in the boat? Mr. Rowe: No, sir. Senator Burton: If Chief Officer Wilde had spoken to them, would you have known it? Mr. Rowe: I think so, because they got in the after part of the boat where I was. Alfred Pierce, pantryman, 3rd class, British Inquiry. Picked up 2 babies in his arms and went into a collapsible boat on the starboard side under Officer Murdoch's order, in which were women and children. There were altogether 66 passengers and 5 of the crew, a quartermaster in charge. The ship had a list on the port side, her lights burning to the last. It was 20 minutes to 2 when they started to row away. He remembers this because one of the passengers gave the time. J.B. Ismay, President, International Mercantile Marine Company of America, New Jersey, USA, American Inquiry. There were 4 in the crew, 1 quartermaster, a pantryman, a butcher, and another. The natural order would be women and children first. It was followed as far as practicable. About 45 in the boat, he saw no struggling or jostling or any attempts by men to get into the boats. They simply picked the women out and put them into the boat as fast as they could, the first ones that were there. He put a great many in, also children. He saw the first lifeboat lowered on the starboard side. As to the circumstances of his departure from the ship, the boat was there. There was a certain number of men in the boat, and the officer called and asked if there were any more women, but there was no response. There were no passengers left on the deck, and as the boat was in the act of being lowered away, he got into it. The Titanic was sinking at the time. He felt the ship going down. He entered because there was room in it. Before he boarded the lifeboat, he saw no passengers jump into the sea. The boat rubbed along the ship's side when being lowered, the women helping to shove the boat clear. This was when the ship had quite a list to port. He sat with his back to the ship, rowing all the time, pulling away. He did not wish to see her go down. There were 9 or 10 men in the boat with him. Mr. Carter, a passenger, was one. All the other people in the boat, so far as he could see, were 3rd-class passengers. Examined before the British Court of Inquiry by the Attorney General, Sir Rufus Isaacs, Mr. Ismay testified, I was awakened by the impact, stayed in bed a little time, and then got up. I saw a steward who could not say what had happened. I put a coat on and went on deck. I saw Captain Smith. I asked him what was the matter, and he said we had struck ice. He said he thought it was serious. I then went down and saw the chief engineer, who said that the blow was serious. He thought the pumps would keep the water under control. I think I went back to my room and then to the bridge and heard Captain Smith give an order in connection with the boats. I went to the boat deck, spoke to one of the officers, and rendered all the assistance I could in putting the women and children in. Stayed there until I left the ship. There was no confusion, no attempts by men to get into the boats. So far as I knew, all the women and children were put on board the boats, and I was not aware that any were left. There was a list of the ship to port. I think I remained an hour and a half on the Titanic after the impact. I noticed her going down by the head, sinking. Our boat was fairly full. After all the women and children got in and there were no others on that side of the deck, I got in while the boat was being lowered. Before we got into the boat, I do not know that any attempt was made to call up any passengers on the boat deck, nor did I inquire. And also examined by Mr. A.C. Edwards, M.P., counsel for the Dock Workers Union, Mr. Ismay's testimony was taken as follows. Mr. Edwards, you were responsible for determining the number of boats. Mr. Ismay, yes, in conjunction with the shipbuilders. Mr. Edwards, you knew when you got into the boat that the ship was sinking. Mr. Ismay, yes. Mr. Edwards, had it occurred to you, apart perhaps from the captain, that you, as the representative managing director, deciding the number of lifeboats, owed your life to every other person on the ship? The President, that is not the sort of question which should be put to this witness. You can make comment on it when you come to your speech if you like. Mr. Edwards, you took an active part in directing women and children into the boats. Mr. Ismay, I did all I could. Mr. Edwards, why did you not go further and send for other people to come on deck and fill the boats? Mr. Ismay, I put in everyone who was there, and I got in as the boat was being lowered away. Mr. Edwards, were you not giving directions and getting women and children in? Mr. Ismay, I was calling to them to come in. Mr. Edwards, why then did you not give instructions or go yourself either to the other side of the deck or below decks to get people up? Mr. Ismay, I understood there were people there sending them up. Mr. Edwards, but you knew there were hundreds who had not come up. Lord Mercy, your point, as I understand it now, is that, having regard for his position as managing director, it was his duty to remain on the ship until she went to the bottom? Mr. Edwards, frankly, that is so, and I do not flinch from it. But I want to get it from the witness, inasmuch as he took it upon himself to give certain directions at a certain time, why he did not discharge his responsibility after in regard to other persons or passengers. Mr. Ismay, there were no more passengers who would have got into the boat. The boat was being actually lowered away. Examined by Sir Robert Finlay for White Star Line. Mr. Finlay, have you crossed very often to and from America? Mr. Ismay, very often. Mr. Finlay, have you ever, on any occasion, attempted to interfere with the navigation of the vessel on any of these occasions? Mr. Ismay, no. Mr. Finlay, when you left the deck just before getting into the collapsible boat, did you hear the officer calling out for more women? Mr. Ismay, I do not think I did, but I heard them calling for women very often. Mr. Edwards, when the last boat left the Titanic, you must have known that a number of passengers and crew were still on board. Mr. Ismay, I did. Mr. Edwards, and yet you did not see any on the deck? Mr. Ismay, no, I did not see any, and I could only assume that the other passengers had gone to the other end of the ship. From an address, British Inquiry, by Mr. A. Clement Edwards, M.P., Counsel for Dock Workers Union. What was Mr. Ismay's duty? Coming to Mr. Ismay's conduct, Mr. Edwards said it was clear that that gentleman had taken upon himself to assist in getting women and children into the boats. He had also admitted that when he left the Titanic, he knew she was doomed, that there were hundreds of people in the ship, that he didn't know whether or not there were any women or children left, and that he did not even go to the other side of the boat deck to see whether there were any women and children waiting to go. Counsel submitted that a gentleman occupying the position of managing director of the company owning the Titanic, and who had taken upon himself the duty of assisting at the boats, had certain special and further duties beyond an ordinary passenger's duties, and that he had no more right to save his life at the expense of any single person on board that ship than the captain would have had. He, Mr. Edwards, said emphatically that Mr. Ismay did not discharge his duty at that particular moment by taking a careless glance around the starboard side of the boat deck. He was one of the few persons who at the time had been placed in a position of positive knowledge that the vessel was doomed, and it was his clear duty, under the circumstances, to see that someone made a search for passengers in other places than in the immediate vicinity of the boat deck. Lord mercy. Moral duty, do you mean? Mr. Edwards, I agree, but I say that a managing director going on board a liner, commercially responsible for it, and taking upon himself certain functions, had a special moral obligation and duty more than is possessed by one passenger to another passenger. Lord mercy. But how is a moral duty relative to this inquiry? It might be argued that there was a moral duty for every man on board, that every woman should take precedence, and I might have to inquire whether every passenger carried out his moral duty. Mr. Edwards agreed that so far as the greater questions involved in this case were concerned, this matter was one of trivial importance. From address of Sir Robert Finlay, KCMP, Counsel for White Star Company, British Inquiry. It has been said by Mr. Edwards that Mr. Ismay had no right to save his life at the expense of any other life. He did not save his life at the expense of any other life. If Mr. Edwards had taken the trouble to look at the evidence, he would have seen how unfounded this charge is. There is not the slightest ground for suggesting that any other life would have been saved if Mr. Ismay had not got into the boat. He did not get into the boat until it was being lowered away. Mr. Edwards has said that it was Mr. Ismay's plain duty to go about the ship looking for passengers, but the fact is that the boat was being lowered. Was it the duty of Mr. Ismay to have remained, though by doing so no other life could have been saved? If he had been impelled to commit suicide of that kind, then it would have been stated that he went to the bottom because he dared not face this inquiry. There is no observation of an unfavorable nature to be made from any point of view upon Mr. Ismay's conduct. There was no duty devolving upon him of going to the bottom with his ship as the captain did. He did all he could to help the women and children. It was only when the boat was being lowered that he got into it. He violated no point of honor. And if he had thrown his life away in the manner now suggested, it would be said he did it because he was conscious he could not face this inquiry, and so he had lost his life. End of section 23, part 6. Section 24 of The Truth About the Titanic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Truth About the Titanic by Archibald Gracie. Starboard Side, Women First, but Men When There Were No Women, Part 7. Engelhart Boat A floated off the ship. Passengers T. Beatty. Footnote. Body found in boat by Oceanic. End of footnote. P.D. Daly. Footnote. Pulled into boat out of sea. End of footnote. G. Rhymes. R. N. Williams, Jr., First Class. O. Abelseth. Footnote. Pulled into boat out of sea. End of footnote. W. J. Mellors, Second Class, and Mrs. Rosa Abbott, footnote. Pulled into boat out of sea. End of footnote. Edward Lindley, footnote. Died in boat. End of footnote. Third Class. Crew, Stewart E. Brown, Fireman J. Thompson, one unidentified body. Footnote, body found in boat by Oceanic. End of footnote. Seaman, one unidentified body. Footnote, body found in boat by Oceanic. End of footnote. An extraordinary story pertains to this boat. At the outset of my research, it was called A Boat of Mystery, occasioned by the statements of the Titanic's officers. In his conversations with me, as well as in his testimony, Officer Lightoller stated that he was unable to loosen this boat from the ship in time, and that he and his men were compelled to abandon their efforts to get it away. The statement in consequence was that this boat A was not utilized but went down with the ship. My recent research has disabused his mind of this supposition. There were only 4 Engelhart boats in all, as we have already learned, and we have fully accounted for the upset boat B and D, the last to leave the ship in the tackles, and boat C, containing Mr. Ismay, which reached the Carpathia side and was unloaded there. After all the mystery, we have reached the conclusion that boat A did not go down with the ship, but was the one whose occupants were rescued by Officer Lowe in the early morning, and then abandoned with 3 dead bodies in it. This also was the boat picked up nearly 1 month later by the Oceanic, nearly 200 miles from the scene of the wreck. I have made an exhaustive research up to date for the purpose of discovering how boat A left the ship. Information in regard thereto was obtained from the testimony before the British Court of Inquiry of Stewart Edward Brown, from first-class passenger R.N. Williams, Jr., and from an account of William J. Mellors, a second cabin passenger as related to him to Dr. Washington Dodge. Stewart Brown, it will be observed, testified that he was washed out of the boat and yet did not know whether he went down in the water. As he could not swim, an analysis of his testimony forces me to believe that he held on to the boat and did not have to swim, and that boat A was the same one that he was in when he left the ship. I am forced to the same conclusion in young Williams' case, after an analysis of his statement that he took off his big fur overcoat in the water and cast it adrift while he swam 20 yards to the boat, and in some unaccountable way the fur coat swam after him and also got into the boat. At any rate, it was found in the boat when it was recovered later as shown in the evidence. I also have a letter from Mr. George Rhymes of Paris, indicating his presence on this same boat, with Messrs. Williams and Mellors and Mrs. Abbott and others. Incidents: Edward Brown Stewart, British Inquiry. Witness helped with boats 5, 3, 1, and C, and then helped with another collapsible. Tried to get it up to the davits when the ship gave a list to port. The falls were slackened, but the boat could not be hauled away any further. There were 4 or 5 women waiting to get into the boat. The boat referred to was the collapsible boat A, which they got off the officer's house. They got it down by the planks, but witness does not know where the planks came from. He thinks they were with the bars which came from the other boats. Yet he had no difficulty in getting the boat off the house. The ship was then up to the bridge under water, well down by the head. He jumped into the boat then and called out to cut the falls. He cut them at the aft end, but cannot say what happened to the forward fall. He was washed out of the boat, but does not know whether he went down in the water. He had his life belt on and came to the top. People were all around him. They tore his clothes away, struggling in the water. He could not swim, but got into the collapsible boat A. Only men were in it, but they picked up a woman and some men afterwards, consisting of passengers, stewards, and crew. There were 16 men. 5th Officer Lowe in boat number 14 picked them up. O. Abelseth, American Inquiry. Witness describes the period just before the ship sank, when an effort was made to get out the collapsible boats on the roof of the officer's house. The officer wanted help and called out, "Are there any sailors here?" It was only about 5 feet to the water when Witness jumped off. It was not much of a jump. Before that, he could see that people were jumping over. He went under and swallowed some water. A rope was tangled round him. He came on top again and tried to swim. There were lots of men floating around. One of them got him on the neck and pressed him under the water and tried to get on top, but he got loose from him. Then another man hung on to him for a while and let go. Then he swam for about 15 or 20 minutes, saw something dark ahead of him, swam towards it, and it was one of the Engelhardt boats A. He had a life preserver on when he jumped from the ship. There was no suction at all. I will try and see, he thought, if I can float on the lifebelt without help from swimming. And he floated easily on the lifebelt. When he got on boat A, no one assisted him, but they said when he got on, "Don't capsize the boat." So he hung on for a little while before he got on. Some were trying to get on their feet who were sitting or lying down. Others fell into the water again. Some were frozen and there were 2 dead thrown overboard. On the boat he raised up and continuously moved his arms and swung them around to keep warm. There was one lady aboard this raft and she, Mrs. Abbott, was saved. There were also 2 Swedes and a first-class passenger. He said he had a wife and child. There was a fireman also named Thompson who had burned one of his hands. Also a young boy whose name sounded like volunteer. He and Thompson were afterwards at St. Vincent's Hospital. In the morning he saw a boat with a sail up, and in unison they screamed together for help. Boat A was not capsized, and the canvas was not raised up, and they could not get it up. They stood all night in about 12 or 14 inches of water, their feet in water all the time. Boat number 14 sailed down and took them aboard and transferred them to the Carpathia, he helping to row. There must have been 10 or 12 saved from Boat A. One man was from New Jersey, with whom he came in company from London. At daybreak he seemed unconscious. He took him by the shoulder and shook him. "Who are you?" he said. "Let me be. Who are you?" About half an hour or so later, he died. In a recent letter from Dr. Washington Dodge, he refers to a young man who he met on the Carpathia, very much exhausted, whom he took to his stateroom and gave him medicine and medical attention. This young man was a gentleman's valet and a second cabin passenger. This answers to the description of William J. Mellors, to whom I have written, but as yet have received no response. Dr. Dodge says he believes this young man's story implicitly. He, Mellors, was standing by this boat when one of the crew was endeavoring to cut the fastenings that bound it to the vessel, just as the onrush of waters came up which tore it loose. It was by clinging to this boat that he was saved. R.N. Williams, Jr., in his letter writes me as follows. I was not underwater very long, and as soon as I came to the top, I threw off the big fur coat I had on. I had put my life belt on under the coat. I also threw off my shoes. About 20 yards away, I saw something floating. I swam to it and found it to be a collapsible boat. I hung on to it and after a while got aboard and stood up in the middle of it. The water was up to my waist. About 30 of us clung to it. When Officer Lowe's boat picked us up, 11 of us were alive. All the rest were dead from cold. My fur coat was found attached to this Engelhardt boat A by the Oceanic, and also a cane-marked C. Williams. This gave rise to the story that my father's body was in this boat, but this, as you see, is not so. How the cane got there, I do not know. Through the courtesy of Mr. Harold Wingate of the White Star Line, in letters to me I had the following information pertaining to Boat A. One of the bodies found in this boat was that of Mr. Thompson Beatty. We got his watch and labels from his clothes showing his name and that of the dealer, which we sent to the executor. 2 others were a fireman and a sailor, both unidentified. The overcoat belonging to Mr. Williams I sent to a furrier to be reconditioned, but nothing could be done with it except to dry it out, so I sent it to him as it was. There was no cane in the boat. The message from the Oceanic and the words R.N. Williams, care of Dwayne Williams, were twisted by the receiver of the message to Richard N. Williams, cane of Dwayne Williams, which got into the press and thus perpetuated the error. There was also a ring found in the boat whose owner we eventually traced in Sweden and restored the property to her. We cannot account for its being in the boat, but we know that her husband was a passenger on the Titanic, Edward P. Lindell, a third-class passenger. The widow's address is care of Nels Persson, Helsingborg, Sweden. Rescue of the occupants of Boat A at daylight Monday morning is recorded in the testimony of Officer Lowe and members of the crew of his boat number 14 and other boats, 12, 10, 4, and D, which were tied together. Number 14, we recall, was emptied of passengers and a crew taken from all the boats referred to went back to the wreck. The substance of the testimony of all of them agrees, and I need only cite that of Quartermaster Bright, in charge of Boat D, as follows. A. Bright, QM, in charge, American Inquiry. Just as daylight witness saw from his place in Boat D one of the other collapsible boats, A, that was awash just flush with the water. Officer Lowe came and towed witness's boat to the other collapsible one that was just awash and took from it 13 men and 1 woman who were in the water up to their ankles. They had been singing out in the dark. As soon as daylight came, they could be seen. They were rescued and the boat turned adrift with 2 dead bodies in it, covered with a lifebelt over their faces. Admiral Mahan on Ismay's duty. Rear Admiral A.T. Mahan, retired, in a letter which the Evening Post publishes, has this to say of J. Bruce Ismay's duty. In the Evening Post of April 24th, Admiral Chadwick passes a distinct approval upon the conduct of Mr. Ismay in the wreck of the Titanic by characterizing the criticism passed upon it as the acme of emotionalism. Both censure and approval had best weight upon the results of the investigations being made in Great Britain. Tongues will wag, but if men like Admiral Chadwick see fit to publish anticipatory opinions, those opinions must receive anticipatory comment. Certain facts are so notorious that they need no inquiry to ascertain. These are, 1, that before the collision, the captain of the Titanic was solely responsible for the management of the ship. 2, after the collision, there were not boats enough to embark more than 1/3 of those on board. And 3, for that circumstance, the White Star Company is solely responsible, not legally, for the legal requirements were met, but morally. Of this company, Mr. Ismay is a prominent, if not the most prominent member. For all the loss of life, the company is responsible, individually and collectively. Mr. Ismay personally, not only as one of the members, he believed the Titanic unsinkable. The belief relieves of moral guilt, but not of responsibility. Men bear the consequences of their mistakes as well as of their faults. He and Admiral Chadwick justify his leaving over 1,500 persons, the death of each one of whom lay on the company, on the ground that it was the last boat half filled, and Mr. Ismay has said, "No one else to be seen." No one to be seen. But was there none to be reached? Mr. Ismay knew there must be many, because he knew the boats could take only a third. The Titanic was 882 feet long, 92 broad, say from 34th Street to a little north of 37th. Within this space were congregated over 1,500 souls on several decks. True, to find any one person at such a moment in the intricacies of a vessel were a vain hope, but to encounter some stragglers would not seem to be. Read in the Sun and Times of April 25th, Colonel Gracie's account of the mass of humanity, men and women, that suddenly appeared before him after the boats were launched. In an interview reported in the New York Times, April 25th, Admiral Sir Cyprian Bridge, a very distinguished officer, holds that Mr. Ismay was but a passenger, as other passengers. True, up to a certain point. He is in no sense responsible for the collision, but when the collision had occurred, he confronted a wholly new condition for which he was responsible, and not the captain, viz., a sinking vessel without adequate provision for saving life. Did no obligation to particularity of conduct rest upon him under such a condition? I hold that under the conditions, so long as there was a soul that could be saved, the obligation lay upon Mr. Ismay that one person, and not he, should have been in the boat. More than 1,500 perished. Circumstances yet to be developed may justify Mr. Ismay's actions completely, but such justification is imperatively required. If this be the acme of emotionalism, I must be content to bear the imputation. Admiral Chadwick urges the preserving a life so valuable to the great organization to which Mr. Ismay belongs. This bestows upon Mr. Ismay's escape a kind of halo of self-sacrifice. No man is indispensable. There are surely brains enough and business capacity enough in the White Star Company to run without him. The reports say that of the rescued women, 37 were widowed by the accident and the lack of boats. Their husbands were quite as indispensable to them as Mr. Ismay to the company. His duty to the ship's company was clear and primary, that to the White Star Company so secondary as to be at the moment inoperative. We should be careful not to pervert standards. Witness the talk that the result is due to the system. What is a system, except that which individuals have made it and keep it? Whatever thus weakens the sense of individual responsibility is harmful. And so likewise is all condemnation of failure of the individual to meet his responsibility. End of section 24.
Concluding note of the truth about the Titanic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. The Truth About the Titanic by Archibald Gracie. Concluding note by Charles Vale. Colonel Gracie died on the 4th of December, 1912. He had been in feeble health all through the summer, but had no definite physical complaint. He felt ill and weak, and ascribed his condition to the exposure and strain through which he went in the Titanic disaster. Mrs. Gracie and his daughter were with him up to the end, which he knew was coming. For the day before he died he had the minister of the Church of the Incarnation brought to his bedside, and Holy Communion was administered. On the next day he was unconscious for 12 hours, but just before he died he became conscious for about 10 minutes, recognizing everyone and bidding them good-bye. The funeral service was held at Calvary Church, where he was married, and a large number of the members of the 7th Regiment, to which he belonged, were present. The church was beautifully decorated. Mrs. Astor was there, and many other Titanic survivors, several of whom Colonel Gracie had helped into the boats at the time of the disaster. The interment took place at the Gracie plot at Woodlawn. And so his book finishes here. He had intended to write a final chapter reviewing the tragedy of the Titanic in retrospect, and in the light of all the later information that he had gathered, drawing the lessons that seemed most necessary in the present and most serviceable to the future, and rounding out his story with the finishing touches. But the actual finesse must be written by another hand. Well, it does not greatly matter. The real work has been completed in its entirety. The picture has been drawn, the details faithfully gathered together and arranged in their due order. The rest was merely an affair of reflection and comment, and of such looking backward there has been already sufficient. I met Colonel Gracie for the first and last time at a luncheon at the Waldorf Astoria in New York, when the world was still ringing with echoes of the great catastrophe. The extraordinary experiences through which he had passed, and the terrible scenes that he had witnessed, were still as vivid to him as if they had happened the day before. But he talked very quietly, directly, unaffectedly, neither obtruding nor avoiding the personal element. There was something strangely gracious in his attitude. I heard no harsh nor condemnatory word from him. He seemed to have the rare gift of comprehension of human nature, the rare sense of proportion. He accused no man of cowardice or inefficiency, but narrated the facts as he saw them, volunteering no inferences. And gradually, in that atmosphere of careless, casual security, with men and women from every corner of more than one continent scattered about the room, with all the obvious and more subtle presuppositions of civilization that a luxurious hotel in a huge metropolis illustrates, there was evolved the picture of a great ship going to her doom in the night with her living cargo. I cannot express fully the vividness of that image, carved, as it were, from the darkness of memory and opposed on the sunlight of a summer's day. It stands out for me ineffaceable, unforgettable, as it must stand out for all who passed through those tragic hours and still live to recall how near they were to death. One retraced the growing realization of the gravity of the situation, the conviction that the ship must inevitably sink before help could arrive, and finally the resolute facing of destiny. Good and bad deeds were done that night and morning, but the good outvalue the bad immeasurably, and when the littleness have been duly reckoned, and the few cowards dismissed, and the uncouth or selfish weighed and found wanting, there remains the grand total of brave and steadfast men and women whose name must be enrolled imperishably in any record of world heroism. In a note like this, closing a work which depends so much on the intimate connection of the author with the scenes that he describes, it is permissible to be personal. I had read in a daily paper Colonel Gracie's first account of his experiences, had been struck by the special quality of his writing, by the pervading atmosphere of true chivalry. No other word can suggest quite adequately the impression conveyed by that narrative, written under the stress of poignant memories. I think that the effect produced by the account was the same with all who read it. Certainly I have met no one who did not recognize the spirituality and fineness shining through the written words, a spirituality not opposed to, but entirely in consonance with the unmistakable virility of the author. And so, when I met him, I was peculiarly interested in his personality. It seemed to me that this man who was sitting at my left hand, talking quietly, had descended as distinctly into hell as any human being would care to acknowledge, and had risen again from the dead, or at least from the sea of the dead, into a world which could never again be quite the same to him. I found myself looking from time to time at his eyes, and I saw in them what I have seen only once or twice in the eyes of living men, the experience of death, the acceptance of death, and the irrevocable impress of death. And though he carried himself as a man accustomed to adventures and unafraid of the big or little ironies of destiny, he was conscious, I think, of a certain isolation, a new aloofness from the ordinary routine of daily life. He had been so near to the end of dreams, and had seen years flash past so suddenly into true perspective, that it was difficult to resume the trivial round and reconstitute a mental world in which details should acquire again their former pretense of importance. Colonel Gracie survived for less than 8 months after the loss of the Titanic. Judged by the imperfect reckoning of impulse, it would seem almost unfair that he should have gone through so much, winning his life in the face of such deadly hazards, only to surrender it after a brief interval. But he himself would have been the last to complain. His implicit faith in Providence could not be shaken by any personal suffering. He made a brave fight for life, as he had made a brave fight for the lives of others while the Titanic was sinking. When the end was inevitable, he accepted it with composure, though he had foreseen it with sadness. The thought of the tragedy with which his name will always be associated was constantly in his mind. The writing of his book involved a great deal of intimate correspondence, with the perpetual revival of painful memories. He made no effort to evade this strain. It was part of the task that he had undertaken. He felt strongly that the work he was doing was absolutely necessary and could not be neglected. It was both a public service and a private duty. Simply and sincerely he dedicated himself to that service and duty. And now he has done his work and lived his life, and gone out into the light beyond the darkness. His country has lost a very gallant gentleman. The world has one more legend of brave deeds. End of concluding note. End of The Truth About the Titanic by Archibald Gracie.